At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the production floor of Dudley and Partners resembled a beehive. The machines hummed with their familiar rhythmic drone, and the mixing paints gave off a familiar chemical smell that I had never learned to ignore in 40 years. The workers moved between the lines with precision honed over years of experience, each knowing their job. In the right-hand corner, Thomas Crane was adjusting the consistency of the white enamel. I could see from the movements of his shoulders that he was adding solvent drop by drop. He was doing it right. On the left, Nancy Drew was checking the viscosity of the blue paint, dipping a metal rod into it and watching how the mixture flowed. She was a good worker, never rushing. I stood by the office window overlooking the workshop and watched the process. These people trusted me. They knew that if Cyprian Dudley said to do something, then that's how it had to be done. Over the decades, we had worked out hundreds of formulas and solved thousands of production problems together. When a supplier sent defective pigment in 1992, I was the one who managed to adjust the composition so as not to disrupt the order for the municipality. When the main mixer broke down 3 years ago, Thomas and I manually brought the batch to the required condition. I remember working until midnight, but the customer received the paint on time. The production of industrial paints is a delicate business. Every component affects the final result. A slight overdose of hardener and the paint sets too quickly, making it impossible to work with. Too little pigment results in a faded color. Too much results in overuse and an imbalance. Over the years, I have memorized these patterns and learned to predict how mixtures will behave under different conditions. Temperature, humidity, mixing time, everything matters. In the corner of the workshop stood our old German-made mixer. We bought it in 1987 and it still works like clockwork. Christopher had repeatedly suggested replacing it with modern equipment, but I knew that this machine produced exactly the texture our paints needed. New mixers work faster, but they have too aggressive an effect on the structure of the mixture. "Mr. Dudley," Nancy called out to me as she approached the office, "could you take a look at this sample? The color isn't quite right." I went down to the workshop and examined the test panel carefully. The blue tint did indeed lean slightly toward green. I took a little paint on my finger and rubbed it between my fingertips. The texture was normal, but the color clearly did not match the standard. There was too much yellow pigment. "Reduce the yellow by 2% and add a drop of red," I said, "but first check the pigment batch. It seems to be more saturated than usual." Nancy carefully wrote down the recommendations in her notebook. She had been working for us for 8 years, having joined us right after college. At first, she was afraid to ask me for advice, but now she knew it was better to check than to redo the whole batch. "What if that doesn't help?" she asked. "Then start over." "But it should help." Nancy nodded and went back to work. Moments like these reminded me why I was here. Not for profit, not for ambition. For the sake of a business I know better than most in this city. For the sake of the people who rely on my experience. In 4 decades in this industry, I've seen many changes, but the basic principles have remained the same. The quality of the raw materials determines the quality of the product. When I first started working in this field, the paint industry in Townsend was completely different. There were many small manufacturers, and competition was fair. Whoever made the best product got the orders. Now, everything has changed. Large corporations have appeared with their own laboratories, marketing departments, and aggressive pricing policies. Many old companies could not withstand the pressure and closed down. I remember old Mr. McDonald, who ran a small factory on the outskirts of town. He made excellent paints for the automotive industry. When the big corporations came, he couldn't compete on price. He sold his equipment and retired, but his paints lasted 15 years without fading. When I returned to my office, I found Daphne there. My sister-in-law was sitting in my chair studying some papers. She was wearing a strict gray suit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Daphne always looked as if she was going to a business meeting, even when she was just visiting the factory. She was holding our financial reports for the last 3 months. The figures were indeed not very encouraging. "Cyprian, we need to talk," she said, without looking up from the documents. "I'm listening." "These raw material costs are completely unjustified." Daphne pointed her pen at the lines in the report. "We are overpaying our suppliers by at least 15%. Christopher has found new partners who are willing to offer better terms." I slowly sat down on a chair opposite my own desk. In recent months, Daphne and my son had been having more and more of these talks. They always started the same way. Criticism of my decisions, suggestions for optimization, hints that it was time to change something. Before, they at least pretended to be interested in my opinion. Now they just informed me of their plans. My participation in decision-making was becoming increasingly formal. Daphne, these suppliers have been working with us for over 20 years. I know the quality of their materials by heart. 20 years is precisely the problem. She finally looked up. You've gotten used to the same people, the same methods. But the world has changed. There are new technologies, new opportunities for savings. There was barely concealed irritation in her voice. It was as if she were explaining something obvious to someone who refused to understand simple things. I had been noticing this tone more and more lately, both in Daphne and Christopher. The patient, patronizing irritation of adults dealing with a stubborn child. They no longer argued with me. They lectured me. What kind of technology do you mean? Christopher studied the proposal from Apex Chemicals. They use synthetic substitutes instead of natural ingredients. This allows them to reduce their cost by a third. I knew Apex Chemicals, a young, aggressive company that really did offer cheap synthetic materials. Their representatives had already visited us 6 months ago and left catalogs and samples. The problem was that the quality of these materials remained questionable. Synthetics do not always behave predictably, especially in complex compositions. Each synthetic substitute has its own characteristics that do not become apparent immediately, but only after months of use. Daphne, our reputation is built on quality. Customers know that Dudley and Partners paints last for years. Customers need an acceptable price. She closed the folder with the reports. You can talk about reputation all you want, but the numbers tell a different story. Our market share has been falling for the third quarter in a row. It was a truth I couldn't dispute. Competition in Townsend had indeed intensified. New players had emerged, offering lower prices. Large construction companies were increasingly choosing cheap suppliers over proven ones. Savings were becoming more important than quality, especially when it came to large volumes. Customers were thinking about today's profits, not what the flooring would look like in 5 years. Where's Christopher? I'd like to discuss this with the three of us. He's meeting with representatives from Apex. Daphne stood up and adjusted her jacket. By the way, they're ready to come next week for a presentation. It would be nice if you could keep an open mind about this. An open mind. Another phrase from Daphne and Christopher's arsenal. Whenever I expressed doubts about their initiatives, the conversation boiled down to the need to be more flexible, open, and modern. It was as if the problem was not the substance of the proposals, but my inability to adapt to new realities. It was as if my 40 years of experience were an obstacle rather than an advantage. After she left, I stared out the window at the workshop for a long time. Thomas had already finished with the white enamel and was moving on to the next batch. Nancy was testing the adjusted blue paint. The color was exactly what was needed. The workers knew their stuff and trusted proven methods. Changing suppliers meant months of adjustment, potential mistakes, and dissatisfied customers. I picked up the phone and dialed Gerald Stevens, our main pigment supplier. I had known Gerald since I was just starting out in the business. We had gone through several economic crises together and helped each other through difficult times. When he had problems with working capital, I gave him a payment extension. When we had a fire in our warehouse, he replaced the damaged raw materials free of charge. Gerald, it's Cyprian. How are you? Oh, Cyprian. I haven't heard your voice in a long time. Everything's fine. We're working. How are you? Working too. Listen, I have a question. What do you know about Apex Chemicals? The pause on the other end of the line was quite telling. Well, they do offer low prices, but there are problems with quality. We had a case where one customer switched to their materials and came back 6 months later. The paint started to fade after just a few months. Another customer had cracks in the coating. I see. What about their reputation in the industry? Cyprian, to be honest, they win on volume and price. Their quality is inconsistent. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's complete rubbish. But for many, that's not critical. The main thing is that it's cheap. I see. Cyprian, you're not going to change suppliers, are you? We've been working together for so many years. Not yet. I'm just exploring my options. After talking to Gerald, I sat in my office for another hour, thinking about the situation. Outside the window, the workday was coming to an end, and people were starting to clean up their workspaces. In a few hours, the workshop would be empty until tomorrow morning. It was interesting to observe how Christopher and Daphne's attitude toward me had changed over the past few months. Before, they would consult me, ask for my opinion, and listen to my objections. Now they just informed me of their decisions. My presence at meetings was becoming more and more formal. They listened to me politely, nodded, and then did their own thing. The next morning, Christopher burst into my office, looking like he had important news. My son looked excited. His eyes were shining, his movements were energetic. Daphne followed him with a folder of documents under her arm. Both radiated the enthusiasm of people who had finally found a solution to all their problems. "Dad, I have great news," Christopher began, without even saying hello. "The meeting with Apex went great. They're willing to give us exclusive terms." He threw a glossy brochure with the Apex Chemicals logo on the table. The cover featured photos of modern production facilities, laboratories with people in white coats, and sales growth charts. Everything looked solid and convincing. "Christopher, let's go over the details first," I said, leafing through the brochure. "The details are simple." Daphne opened a folder and laid several documents on the table. "They are offering to reduce our raw material costs by 32%. 32%, Cyprian? Do you understand what that means for profitability?" I understood. Such savings could indeed radically change our financial situation, but I also understood something else. Offers like this usually have hidden pitfalls. What about quality? What guarantees do they give? "Here are all their certificates." Christopher pointed to a stack of papers. "International quality standards, compliance with all technical requirements. Plus, they are willing to provide a 1-month trial period." I picked up one of the certificates. The document looked official, with the correct stamps and signatures. But over the years, I had learned to read between the lines. The certificate confirmed that the materials met general standards, but said nothing about long-term stability, behavior in different climatic conditions, or compatibility with other components. "Christopher, a month is too short a period for a full test. Some problems only become apparent after 6 months or a year of operation." "Father, we can't afford the luxury of a year of testing," her son replied irritably. "While we're testing every component, our competitors will take over our market." Daphne nodded in agreement and added, "Cyprian, times have changed. Modern business requires quick decisions. Those who fail to adapt are left behind." Her tone had familiar notes of patronizing patience. It was as if she were explaining to a child why it was dangerous to play with matches. This tone was becoming more and more common in our conversations, both with Daphne and Christopher. They no longer saw me as an equal partner in the business. "Daphne, I understand the need to adapt, but the quality of our products is what sets us apart from our competitors. One defective batch and our reputation will be ruined forever." "Reputation, reputation," Christopher waved his hand. "What good is reputation if the company goes bankrupt? Look at the sales figures for the last 6 months. We are losing customers precisely because of high prices." He was right about the figures. Sales were indeed falling. Large customers were increasingly choosing cheaper suppliers, but I also knew that many of these suppliers disappeared from the market within a year or two, unable to meet quality standards. "Christopher, let's at least test their materials on a small batch. We'll do a trial mix and check all the characteristics." "Dad, we don't have time for experiments." There was a sharp tone in his son's voice. "Haha, the representatives of Apex are waiting for an answer by the end of the week. This is an exclusive offer. They won't wait forever." Daphne opened another document and placed it in front of me. "Here's the draft contract. All the terms are written in our favor. Fixed prices for a year, free shipping, and a 30-day payment deferral." I scanned the text of the contract. The terms did look attractive. Too attractive. In business, no one gives gifts for nothing. Every concession is calculated. "What about penalties for quality violations?" "Everything is standard," Daphne replied. "Reimbursement for the cost of defective products, plus compensation for losses. That only covers direct losses. What about reputational risks? If our client is hit with claims because of poor paint, who will compensate for the damage?" "Dad, you're thinking too much about the risks." Christopher began to lose patience. There are always risks in business. The main thing is not to miss the opportunity. Christopher, you have to calculate the risks, especially when it comes to changing proven suppliers. Proven? Daphne smirked. Your proven suppliers are suffocating us with their prices. Gerald Stevens has raised his prices twice in the last year, and the quality of his pigments is not what it used to be. That was not true. The quality of Gerald's products remained consistent. Yes, prices had risen, but that was due to the general increase in the cost of raw materials on the world market. Gerald never inflated prices without objective reasons. Daphne, Gerald's price increases are justified by the rise in production costs. He provided us with documents confirming this. Documents can be forged, Daphne shrugged, but Apex's offer is a real opportunity to break out of the vicious cycle of unprofitability. Unprofitability, a word that was increasingly heard in our conversations. The company was indeed going through difficult times, but it was still far from unprofitable. Profits had declined, but we were still in the black. Christopher, what do our technologists say about changing suppliers? I haven't shared the details with them yet, replied my son. First, we need a fundamental decision from management. In other words, the decision has already been made, and no one is interested in the opinion of the people who will be working with the new materials. Thomas Crane and Nancy Drew, who know our production better than most, will be left out of the discussion. I think it's essential to consult with the engineers. They know the specifics of production better. Dad, the engineers will do what they're told, Christopher cut in. Their job is to follow management's instructions, not make strategic decisions. This statement reflected my son's new attitude toward people who had been working for the company for many years. He used to treat them with respect and listen to their opinions. Now in his eyes, they had become mere executors. Christopher, these people are not just executors. They know every detail of our production. Details can be learned, Daphne interjected, but the opportunity to gain a competitive advantage doesn't come along every day. She spoke confidently, without a shadow of a doubt. For Daphne, the issue had already been decided. All that remained was to overcome the resistance of the stubborn old man who refused to acknowledge the obvious facts. Okay, I said, let's hold a general meeting. We'll invite the technologists and see how they react. Why do we need a meeting? Christopher rose from his chair. We have a specific proposal with specific figures. Either we accept it or we lose our chance to get out of the crisis. What crisis, Christopher? We're operating profitably. Profitable? He picked up the financial report from the table. Profits have fallen by 40% in 6 months. Isn't that a crisis? These are temporary difficulties. The market is not going through the best of times, but the situation is stabilizing. When will it stabilize? In a year? In 2? Daphne closed the folder with the documents. And while we wait for stabilization, our competitors will take our positions. There was some truth in her words. The market had indeed changed, and competition had intensified. But I had also seen how quickly companies that sacrificed quality for short-term gain disappeared. Short-term savings often turn into long-term losses. Daphne, I'm not against change, but any changes must be well thought out. Well thought out? Christopher smiled. We've been thinking for 6 months. While we're thinking, others are acting. He began gathering documents from the table, clearly signaling that the conversation was over. Father, the decision must be made by Friday. That's Apex's final word. And if I say no? Christopher and Daphne exchanged glances. There was something in that look that I didn't like. It was as if they had discussed the possibility of my refusal in advance and knew how to proceed in such a situation. Father, Christopher said slowly, you must understand that the days of unilateral decisions are over. Now the 3 of us run the company. The phrase sounded almost like a warning. There are 3 of us, but if 2 are against 1, the opinion of that one is not decisive. I was the owner of the company, but actual management was gradually passing to the younger generation. After they left, I sat in my empty office for a long time, thinking about what had happened. The conversation was more like an ultimatum than a discussion. Christopher and Daphne had not come for advice, but for formal approval of a decision that had already been made. The problems began on Tuesday morning. I arrived at the factory at the usual time, around 8 in the morning, and immediately sensed tension in the air. Thomas Crane stood by line number 3 with a grim expression, while Nancy Drew leaned over the paint samples, shaking her head periodically. Something was wrong. "Thomas, what's the problem?" I asked as I approached them. "Mr. Dudley, we're having trouble with the batch for Harrison Construction." Thomas showed me a palette with dried paint. "The coating is uneven, and there are streaks." I examined the sample closely. The surface was indeed far from ideal. The paint had settled in patches, thicker in some places and very thin in others. As it dried, characteristic streaks formed that could not be hidden by any subsequent processing. "When was this discovered?" "Last night after the shift ended," Nancy replied. "We prepared the batch using standard technology, and all parameters were normal. But when we made a control sample, we saw these defects." I took the sample in my hands and carefully examined the texture. The problem was not only the unevenness of the coating. The paint did not adhere well to the surface and had already begun to peel off in places. This usually happened when the proportions of the components were violated or poor quality raw materials were used. "Which batch of pigment did you use?" "A new one that arrived last Friday," said Thomas. "From our usual supplier. All the documents are in order." Strange. Gerald Stevens never delivered defective products. In 20 years of cooperation, there had been no more than 3 cases of serious quality violations, and each time he quickly resolved the problem. "Did you check the solvent?" "Of course," Nancy nodded. "The viscosity is normal. No impurities. The hardener is also standard. I asked for the process log. It recorded all stages of production, mixing time, temperature, quantity of each component. According to the records, everything looked normal. The recipe was followed exactly, with no deviations from standard technology." "Thomas, try making another sample. Take the pigment from the previous batch." While Thomas was preparing a new sample, I called Gerald Stevens. Perhaps he had problems with the last shipment that he didn't know about yet. "Gerald, I have a question about the last batch of blue pigment." "What's wrong?" I could hear the alarm in his voice. "The paint is uneven and streaky. This never happened before." "Cyprian, that's impossible. I personally checked the quality of this batch. All the tests are normal." "Can you double-check the documentation?" "Of course, I'll take a look right now. I'll call you back in half an hour." At that moment, Christopher and Daphne entered the workshop. Both looked concerned. Apparently, someone had already reported the problems with the batch to them. "Father, what's going on here?" Christopher asked, looking at the samples of defective paint. "Quality issues. We're investigating the cause." Daphne took one of the samples and turned it over in her hands. "So, the whole batch is defective?" "We're still checking," I replied. "Thomas is making control samples." "How much paint has been produced?" "About 2,000 liters, said Nancy. Daphne turned pale. 2,000 liters of paint at cost is more than $15,000, plus delivery deadlines for Harrison Construction, plus reputational risks. When does the order need to be shipped?" "Friday morning," Thomas replied. There were 3 days left until Friday. If the entire batch was indeed defective, a new one had to be made urgently. But first, the cause of the defect had to be understood. Otherwise, the same problem could recur. "Cyprian," Daphne said tensely, "this could seriously damage our reputation. Harrison Construction is one of our biggest customers." I understood that. James Harrison had been working with us for 5 years, ordering paint for his construction projects. Losing such a client would be painful, especially in the current market situation. The phone rang. It was Gerald. "Cyprian, I've checked all the documentation. The pigment is fine. The tests show full compliance with standards." "Did you do a visual inspection?" "Of course. The color matches the standard, and so does the consistency." "Okay, thank you. The problem was clearly not with the pigment. We had to look for the cause elsewhere. Perhaps it was the batch of solvent or hardener." "Thomas, what are the results with the control sample?" "The same," he replied gloomily. "Stains, uneven coverage. So the problem isn't with a specific batch of pigment. Something has changed in the overall technology or in other components." Christopher paced nervously around the workshop, glancing at his watch from time to time. "We need to find the cause urgently. We only have 3 days left." "Christopher, rushing won't help here," I said. "We need to methodically check every component." "Methodically?" Daphne raised her voice. "We don't have time to be methodical. If we miss the delivery, Harrison Construction may terminate the contract. She was right about the deadlines, but panicking wasn't going to solve the problem either. In situations like this, the key is to keep a clear head and systematically analyze all possible causes. Nancy, bring me samples of all the raw materials that have been used over the last week. While Nancy was gathering the samples, I asked Thomas to prepare several test batches with different combinations of ingredients. We needed to find out which ingredient was causing the problem. Dad, maybe we should contact other suppliers, Christopher suggested. Maybe we can find a replacement for the problematic raw material. First, we need to understand what the problem is. We don't have time to figure it out. Daphne was starting to lose her composure. We need to act right now. At that moment, Thomas called me over to the work table. Mr. Dudley, look at this. He showed me 2 tablets. On one, the paint was smooth with no defects. On the other, there were the same streaks and unevenness. What's the difference? In the first sample, I used a hardener from the old batch, and in the second, I used one from the new batch. There's your answer. The problem was with the hardener. The new batch apparently had different characteristics, which upset the balance of the entire formula. When did the new batch of hardener arrive? Monday morning, Nancy replied after checking the documents. Monday, that was when they started producing the batch for Harrison Construction. The coincidence was too obvious. Who was the supplier? Chemtech Solutions. Nancy pointed to the delivery note. I didn't know this company. We usually bought the hardener from a trusted supplier we had been working with for several years. Why did you change suppliers? Christopher and Daphne exchanged glances. I saw something like confusion in their eyes. We decided to try a more advantageous offer, Christopher said uncertainly. Without consulting me? Dad, it was a purely technical decision. The hardener is the same, just from a different manufacturer. But curing agents from different manufacturers could vary significantly in their characteristics, even if they formally complied with the same standard. Curing time, temperature stability, compatibility with other components, all of these could vary. Christopher, changing suppliers of key components must be agreed with the technologists. What difference does it make? Daphne snapped. The main thing now is to solve the problem, not to find out who is to blame. But it was necessary to find out the cause in order to prevent a recurrence in the future. You can't just eliminate the symptoms without understanding the root of the problem. Thomas, can you adjust the recipe for the new hardener? I'll try, but it will take time. I need to do a few test batches to find the right proportions. How long? At least a day, preferably 2. Daphne clutched her head. 2 days? We don't have 2 days. Daphne, you can't do quality work in a rush, I said. What do you suggest? Cancel the delivery? I suggest finding reserves of the old hardener or urgently ordering it from a trusted supplier. Christopher shook his head. Father, the old hardener is no longer available, and our regular supplier won't be able to deliver a new batch before next week. So they've completely cut off our retreat. They changed suppliers without leaving any reserves and without testing the new material. A classic mistake of inexperienced management. Then we'll have to explain the situation to the customer and ask them to postpone the deadline. That's impossible. Daphne was close to panic. Harrison Construction won't agree to a postponement. They have their own construction schedule. Daphne, it's better to explain the situation honestly than to deliver defective products. Explain honestly? Christopher laughed nervously. Say that we can't handle a simple order? That's the end of our reputation. A tense silence hung over the workshop. Everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. Thomas and Nancy exchanged glances, not knowing what to say. They were used to stable work and well-established processes. Such a rush was rare. Okay, I said. Thomas, start adjusting the recipe. Work until you get results. Nancy, contact our old hardener supplier. Maybe they have some of the batch we need left over. And I'll try to negotiate a short delay with Harrison Construction, added Christopher. Daphne was silent, clearly weighing the possible consequences of the situation. Her eyes betrayed her anxiety and irritation. The irritation was directed especially at me, as if I were to blame for not preventing the problem. The next few hours were spent working feverishly. Thomas methodically tested various proportions of the components, trying to achieve an acceptable coating quality. Nancy called suppliers looking for reserves of the necessary hardener. I coordinated the process and advised on technical issues. By the end of the day, it was clear that there would be no quick solution. The new formula required fine-tuning, and we couldn't find a suitable hardener. The situation was becoming critical. On Thursday morning, the situation reached a critical point. Thomas was unable to achieve acceptable paint quality with the new hardener, and no alternative suppliers could be found. There was less than a day left before the order was to be shipped, and we had no finished product to deliver to the customer. I arrived at work at 7:30 a.m., hoping to hold an emergency meeting and find a way out of the situation. Perhaps it would have been worth contacting other paint manufacturers in Townsend. Someone might have been able to help with the urgent order. Or we could have negotiated with Harrison Construction for a partial delivery with the rest of the volume to be completed within a week. However, when I entered my office, Christopher and Daphne were already sitting there. Both looked gloomy, and there were some documents on the table. The atmosphere in the room was tense, as if a serious confrontation was brewing. "Father, sit down," Christopher said in an even tone. "We need to have a serious talk." I sat down in my chair, feeling a growing sense of unease. There was something threatening in my son and daughter-in-law's behavior, a kind of grim determination. "I'm listening." Daphne moved the folder with the documents closer and opened it. "Cyprian, we have analyzed the situation in the company. The results are very disappointing." She took out several sheets of paper with graphs and tables. The numbers really didn't look good. A drop in sales, a decline in profits, the loss of several customers in recent months. "Over the last quarter, our revenue has fallen by 38%, Daphne continued. "Profits have more than halved. We are losing our competitive edge." "Daphne, these are temporary difficulties. The entire market is going through a rough patch right now." "Temporary?" Christopher shook his head. "Father, look at our competitors. Many of them are actually increasing their volumes." He showed me another document, an analysis of the activities of other paint manufacturers in the region. Indeed, several companies were showing sales growth. "These companies operate according to modern principles," explained Daphne. "They are not afraid to change suppliers, introduce new technologies, or optimize processes." I understood where the conversation was going. Once again, it was about the need for radical change, about my conservatism as the main cause of all the problems. "And now this story with the defective batch," Christopher pointed to the paint samples lying on the table. "We can't deliver the order on time. The customer is dissatisfied. Our reputation is suffering." "Christopher, the problems with the hardener were not my fault." "Not your fault?" Daphne raised her voice. "Then who is responsible for quality control of raw materials? Who was supposed to check the new hardener before it went into production?" Technically, she was right. As the company's chief technologist, I was indeed responsible for controlling the quality of all materials. But the change of supplier happened without my knowledge. I only found out about it after the problems arose. "Daphne, I was not informed about the change of supplier for the curing agent." "Of course," she sneered. "Everyone is always to blame except you. Suppliers are bad, the market is complicated, competitors are dishonest. And you, of course, have nothing to do with it." Her voice was filled with undisguised contempt. It was as if she had held back for a long time and finally decided to say everything she thought. "Daphne, I have always taken responsibility for my decisions, and I am ready to take responsibility now. Let's find a way out of this situation together." "There is a way out," said Christopher, "and it's obvious." He stood up and began pacing around the office, clearly preparing for the decisive phrase. "Father, it's time to face the obvious. Your management methods are outdated. Your suppliers are not competitive. Your understanding of the modern market leaves much to be desired." Each phrase hit like a blow. The son spoke calmly, even sympathetically, as if explaining to a sick person the necessity of a painful but inevitable operation. "Daphne and I are ready to take full responsibility for managing the company, but on the condition that we have a free hand." "Meaning?" "It means that you will remove yourself from operational management," Daphne stated clearly. "No interference in our decisions, no attempts to sabotage changes." Sabotage changes. So my attempts to maintain product quality and supplier reliability were perceived by them as sabotage. "And if I don't agree?" "Then the company will go bankrupt," Christopher shrugged. "And there will be no one to blame but you." Daphne took out another document and placed it in front of me. "Here is the management restructuring plan. You remain the nominal head, but we make all operational decisions." I skimmed through the text. The document was professionally drafted with legal precision. In effect, I was being asked to relinquish actual control of my own company. I understand this is a painful decision, Christopher continued sympathetically, but there is no alternative. Either we radically change our approach to business or we close down. Christopher, I built this company. 40 years of my life have been invested in this business. That's exactly why you shouldn't let it die, replied Daphne. Hand over management to those who understand modern realities. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Thomas Crane entered with a guilty expression on his face. Sorry to interrupt, but Harrison Construction called. They're asking about the status of the order. An awkward pause ensued. Everyone knew that the order was not ready and was unlikely to be ready by the deadline. What did you tell them? Christopher asked. I said I'd check and call back. Okay, thank you, Thomas. After Thomas left, the atmosphere in the office became even more tense. The failed order was clear confirmation of all the accusations made by Christopher and Daphne. See, said Daphne, while we're discussing principles, we're losing customers. Harrison Construction will never come back to us after a failure like this. Maybe there's still something we can do, I suggested. What exactly? Christopher spread his arms. There's no time left. The paint isn't ready. The customer's waiting. We could ask for an extension and explain the situation. Explain that we can't handle a simple order? Daphne smiled contemptuously. That's the last thing we can do. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the production floor. You know what, Cyprian? Enough, just enough. We're tired of your excuses, your justifications, your unwillingness to face reality. A metallic note appeared in her voice. Daphne no longer tried to be polite or diplomatic. You've become a burden to your own company. You're hindering progress, stifling all progressive initiatives, clinging to the past. Daphne, no, don't interrupt. She turned sharply toward me. It's time to tell you the truth to your face. You're useless. Do you understand? Useless. The words sounded like a slap in the face. 40 years of work, thousands of problems solved, a company built from scratch. All of it was declared useless. Your knowledge is outdated, Daphne continued. Your methods are ineffective. Your suppliers are ripping us off for mediocre quality, and you still think you're irreplaceable. Christopher was silent, but his gaze showed that he agreed with every word his wife said. My own son looked at me as if I were a nuisance that needed to be gotten rid of. And what do you suggest? Get out, Daphne blurted out. Just get out and let us work. Take your pension and go relax. Go fishing, grow tomatoes, do whatever you want, just don't get in the way. Christopher put his hand on her shoulder as if trying to calm her down, but he didn't argue. Father, Daphne is harsh, but she's right. You really should step down. I slowly rose from the table and looked at them both. Two people who had recently treated me with respect were now demanding my departure. And they weren't just demanding that I hand over my authority, but that I disappear completely. All right, I said quietly. I understand. Daphne smiled triumphantly, and Christopher nodded with a look of relief. It's the right decision, Father. I opened the desk drawer and began to take out my personal belongings. An old calculator that had served me for 20 years, several chemistry reference books, a photograph from the factory opening, commemorative gifts from clients. Cyprian, you can take your time packing your things, Daphne said in a softer tone. No one is rushing you. But I knew that the sooner I left, the better it would be for everyone. Staying here after that conversation was unbearable. I packed everything into a box, put on my coat, and took my car keys. Christopher and Daphne watched my actions in silence. Their faces showed satisfaction and anticipation of freedom. Father, Christopher said as I headed for the door, don't take it to heart. It's just business. Just business. 40 years of my life. Just business. As I left the office, I heard Daphne say to Christopher, finally, now we can work properly. Thomas Crane saw me in the hallway. He looked at the box in my hands with surprise. Mr. Dudley, are you leaving? Yes, Thomas, I'm leaving. For good? I nodded. Thomas shook his head in confusion, not understanding what was happening. What about production? Who will control quality? Other people will take care of that now. Passing through the workshop, I ran into Nancy Drew. She also looked at my things with confusion. Mr. Dudley? It's okay, Nancy. There's just a change in management. In the parking lot, I loaded the box into my car and got behind the wheel. Through the window, I could see Christopher and Daphne talking animatedly in my former office. They were already making plans for the future without me. I started the engine and slowly drove out of the premises that I had considered my home for 40 years. The first few days after leaving the company were strange and painful. I woke up at 6:30 a.m. out of habit, automatically reached for my phone to check messages from the factory, and only then remembered that I was no longer expected there. 40 years of habit don't disappear overnight. The house seemed too quiet. My wife died 5 years ago, and my children grew up and started their own families, except for Christopher. Now he has effectively cut me out of his life. All that remained was the echo of my own footsteps in the empty rooms and the ticking of the old clock in the living room. On Saturday morning, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and tried to figure out what to do next. 72 is an age when many people have long since retired. I could have resigned myself to it, found a hobby, taken up gardening. But something inside me protested against such a scenario. I still had too much energy, too much knowledge and experience. What worried me most was the fate of the company. Christopher and Daphne were smart people, but they lacked practical experience. They saw the numbers in the reports, but they didn't understand the production process. They didn't understand the subtle connections between the quality of raw materials, manufacturing technology, and the final result. The story with the hardener was telling. A few percent in savings resulted in the loss of a large order and damage to the company's reputation. Such mistakes are costly, especially in our business, where reputation is built over years. On Monday, I decided to visit Gerald Stevens. I needed to find out how the situation with Dudley and Partners was developing, and at the same time, get an overview of the market. Gerald was always up to date with all the industry news. The Stevens Chemicals office was located in an industrial area in a small two-story building. Gerald welcomed me into his office, which was filled with product samples and technical catalogs. "Cyprian," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I heard about your changes. How are you doing?" "Still getting used to the new reality." "I understand. How's your company doing? I heard they had problems with their last order for Harrison Construction." Gerald was up to date with current events. Not surprising, since everyone knew everyone else in Townsend. "Yes, there were problems. They changed the supplier of the hardener without testing the material. As a result, the entire batch was defective." "That's unfortunate." Gerald shook his head. "Who did they choose instead of your usual supplier?" "Chemtech Solutions." Gerald frowned. "Cyprian? Their quality varies from batch to batch. I tried working with them a year ago and had a terrible time. Sometimes the hardener is too active. Sometimes it doesn't work at all." Apparently, Christopher and Daphne didn't know that. "Didn't you warn them?" "I wasn't informed about the change in the supplier." Gerald raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Really? Such decisions were made without you?" "Gerald, I no longer work for the company. I was asked to leave." We were silent for a moment. Gerald clearly didn't know what to say in this situation. "By the way," I continued, "what's the latest on Apex Chemicals?" Christopher was very keen to work with them. "Oh, that's an interesting story." Gerald leaned back in his chair. "They do offer low prices. But do you know why?" I shook my head. "Because they buy their raw materials in China through third parties. The quality is inconsistent, and the documentation is questionable. Plus, they skimp on laboratory testing. They only check every 10th batch. Don't customers complain?" "They complain, and how?" "I have a friend who switched to their materials. 6 months later, the paint started peeling off half of the objects. He had to redo everything at his own expense. The information was valuable. It turned out that the decision to cooperate with Apex could have been disastrous for Dudley and Partners. What is known about Harrison Construction's plans? They are now without a paint supplier. Yes, James Harrison was very unhappy. I hear he is already in talks with Colored Industries. Colored Industries is one of our main competitors. If they get the contract with Harrison Construction, it will be a serious blow to Dudley and Partners' position." "Gerald, how do you assess the prospects for the industrial paint market in Townsend?" "It's mixed. On the one hand, construction is growing and demand is increasing. On the other hand, price competition is intensifying. Many manufacturers are willing to work at zero profit just to retain customers." Are there any new players? There are, but they are mostly resellers who don't manufacture anything themselves. They buy in bulk from large factories and sell cheaper than local manufacturers. The picture was becoming clearer. The market was indeed changing, but not in the direction Christopher and Daphne had imagined. Price competition did not lead to increased efficiency, but to a decline in quality. It was not the best who survived, but the cheapest. After talking to Gerald, I went to the city library. I needed to study the financial statements of the main competitors to understand their development strategies. Many companies publish their reports in the public domain. After spending several hours at the computer, I had a fairly complete picture of the market. Most paint manufacturers in Townsend were indeed going through difficult times. Profitability was falling, and many were cutting staff. But there were exceptions. Premium Coatings was a small company that specialized in high-quality coatings for industrial facilities. They did not chase volume, but their products were in demand among customers who valued reliability. Their profitability was growing. Special finishes worked in a narrow niche, paints for extreme operating conditions, seaports, chemical plants, metallurgy. Their products were several times more expensive than ordinary ones, but there were practically no alternatives. It turned out that the way out of the crisis lay not in reducing costs, but in specializing in high-quality products for demanding customers. This was the direction in which Dudley and Partners needed to develop. In the evening, I called Robert Keith, whom I had met at an industry conference several years ago. Robert was head of procurement for a large construction corporation in a neighboring state. "Robert, this is Cyprian Dudley from Townsend. Do you remember me?" "Of course I do. How are you, Cyprian?" "Fine, working on new projects. Tell me, how are things going with your industrial paint suppliers?" "Honestly, not very well. There are constant quality issues. Contractors complain that the paints do not meet the specified characteristics." "What specifically is unsatisfactory?" "The durability of the coating, first and foremost. They claim a 10-year service life, but after 2 years the paint starts to peel off. We have to redo the work, which means additional costs." "Robert, what if a supplier appeared who guaranteed high quality, but at a price above the market average?" "You know, we would be willing to pay more for reliability. It's better to buy something more expensive than to redo the work twice." This confirmed my assumptions. The high-quality paint segment was not oversaturated, and there was demand for reliable products. On Wednesday, I met with Margaret Turner, a buyer from Townsend Construction. This company specialized in industrial facilities, factories, warehouses, and office centers. "Margaret, how are things with the paint suppliers?" "Terrible, Cyprian. Everyone is chasing cheap prices, and quality is suffering. Last week we received a batch of paint. The color doesn't match the sample, and the consistency is uneven." "Who was the supplier?" "Low-cost coatings. We were attracted by the low price, and now we're suffering." "Margaret, what if Dudley and Partners resume working with industrial customers? I know you've had breaks in your cooperation. We would be happy to come back to you. Your paint has always been reliable, but lately, for some reason, the quality has declined. Apparently, Christopher and Daphne's experiments with cheap materials had already made themselves felt. The company's reputation had indeed suffered. By the end of the week, I had a clear picture of the situation. Dudley and Partners was rapidly losing ground due to its pursuit of cheapness. Customers were dissatisfied with the decline in quality. Competitors were seizing the vacant niches. At the same time, demand for quality products not only remained, but even grew. Construction companies were tired of problems with poor quality materials and were willing to pay more for reliability. The question remained, what to do with the information I had gathered. I could have tried to return to Dudley and Partners and explain to Christopher and Daphne what they were doing wrong. But after the humiliation they had subjected me to, that option seemed unacceptable. I could have just forgotten about everything and enjoyed a well-deserved rest. But every day of inaction became more and more difficult. My energy demanded an outlet. My experience begged to be put to use. Or I could have considered a third option, using my knowledge and connections to create something new. By Monday of the following week, I had made my decision. If my experience and knowledge could still be of use, I had to take advantage of them. But now it was not for Dudley and Partners, but for something of my own. The idea was bold for a man of my age, but the alternative, slowly fading away within four walls, seemed worse than any risk. The first thing I did was contact Gerald Stevens. If I was going to start a new business, I needed reliable suppliers, and Gerald had always been one of the best. Gerald, I have a proposal, I said when I met him at his office. What if we try to create something new in the field of industrial paints? He looked at me intently. Cyprian, are you serious? Absolutely. I have experience and connections with potential customers. You have high-quality raw materials and production capacity for small batches. What exactly are you proposing? Specialized paints for industrial facilities. High quality, an individual approach to each customer. Not mass production, but piecework. Gerald thought for a moment. Interesting, but that will require investment in development, testing, a small investment. I have the basic formulas in my head, and the technology has been tested. It just needs to be adapted to specific tasks. We talked for over an hour, discussing the details of a possible collaboration. Gerald agreed to supply raw materials on favorable terms in exchange for a share of future profits. This solved one of the main problems, startup costs. The next step was to study the legal aspects. I turned to Frank Miller, a lawyer who had been handling our family's affairs for many years. Frank, is it possible to register a new company if I am still formally associated with Dudley and Partners? Cyprian, it depends on the terms of your departure from the company. Are there any restrictions or non-compete clauses? I got out the documents I had signed when I left. Christopher and Daphne were so confident that they were in the right that they did not include any restrictive clauses in the agreement. There are no restrictions, Frank said after reviewing the papers. Formally, you can engage in any activity. What about the use of developments and formulas? If these are your personal developments made over years of work, then there are no problems. Intellectual property remains with the author. The legal issue was resolved. Now it was time to think about the production base. My old friend Edward Palmer ran a small industrial equipment repair shop on the outskirts of Townsend. We had started our careers together, he in mechanical engineering and I in the chemical industry. Ed, do you have any free space in your workshop? Of course I do. What do you need it for? I'm thinking of setting up a small paint production facility. Nothing on a large scale, just to order. Edward listened to my plans with interest. Sounds reasonable, Cyprian. I happen to have a space of about 200 square meters. It used to be a paint shop. We looked at the space. It was perfect for a small production facility. Good ventilation, water supply, enough room for equipment. How much will the rent be? For you, it will be a nominal fee, let's say, to cover utility costs. Edward had always been a generous man. In our youth, we often helped each other out, and this mutual assistance continued for many years. Now we had to decide on the equipment. For small batches of specialized paints, we didn't need huge mixers and automatic lines. All we needed were a few mixers, containers for storing components, and laboratory equipment for quality control. I contacted Thomas Hudson, who sold used industrial equipment. He always had good machines at reasonable prices. Thomas, I need equipment for a small paint production facility. Cyprian, I heard you're no longer working at Dudley and Partners. Decided to start your own business? Something like that. I need mixers, containers, dispensers. I happen to have a set of equipment from a small factory that recently closed down. It's German-made and in good condition. We agreed to meet at Thomas's warehouse. The equipment was indeed high quality. Mixers with adjustable rotation speeds, stainless steel containers, and precise dispensers for liquid components. How much for the whole set? For you, $25,000. It was a very good price. New equipment would cost 3 times as much. The amount was manageable. Over the years, I had saved money, and I had enough savings to purchase the equipment and cover the initial operating costs. While the deal was being finalized, I continued to study the market and look for potential customers. Robert Keith from a neighboring state agreed to consider cooperation if I could offer high-quality paints for industrial facilities. Robert, what specific characteristics are you interested in? First and foremost, resistance to aggressive environments. We have a lot of orders from chemical plants where conventional paints deteriorate quickly. What about the color range? Not critical. The main thing is functionality and durability. This simplified the task. Specialized paints for the chemical industry are a narrow but profitable niche. There are few competitors, quality requirements are high, and customers are willing to pay for reliability. I contacted several suppliers of special additives and pigments. Paints that are resistant to aggressive environments require special components, epoxy resins, zinc pigments, and special hardeners. The most difficult issue was certification. Industrial paints must meet strict safety and quality standards. Obtaining certificates is a long and expensive process, but my many years of experience helped me here. During my years at Dudley and Partners, I learned all the requirements and procedures, knew the certification laboratories, and understood what tests were needed for specific types of paints. Dr. Anderson, this is Cyprian Dudley. Do you remember me? Dr. Anderson headed one of the best chemical laboratories in the region. We worked together for many years when I was at Dudley and Partners. Of course I remember you, Cyprian. I hear you've had a change in your career. Yes, I'm starting a new project. I'll need help with the certification of special paints. What type? Coatings for the chemical industry, resistant to acids and alkalis. Interesting. This is a promising area. Contact me when you're ready for testing. Gradually, all the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Raw material suppliers, production space, equipment, potential customers, certification support. The foundation for a new business was ready. But most importantly, I had a sense of purpose. After weeks of meaningless existence, I felt needed and in demand again. My knowledge and experience were being put to new use. On Friday evening, I sat at my kitchen table at home, sorting through documents and drawing up a business plan for the future enterprise. The figures looked promising. With small volumes and high quality, the profitability could be very good. I chose a simple name for the new company: Industrial Coating Solutions. No hints of family origins, no references to the past. A completely new venture. The official registration was scheduled for Monday. Frank Miller had prepared all the necessary documents. All that remained was to sign the papers and pay the registration fee. It was getting dark outside. Somewhere else in the city, Christopher and Daphne were probably celebrating their freedom from my influence. They thought they had removed the obstacle to their prosperity. It would be interesting to see how they would manage the company without an experienced technologist, especially when quality complaints start pouring in and problems arise with new suppliers. But that's no longer my concern. I now had my own plans and my own goals. Time will tell which of us chose the right strategy. The phone rang. It was Gerald Stevens. Cyprian, I have news. A friend from Premium Construction just called. They urgently need special paints for a new project, a fertilizer plant. What are the requirements? Resistance to ammonia and other aggressive substances. It's a big order, and the deadline is tight. My first serious client appeared earlier than I expected. Gerald, when do they need an answer? Preferably by Wednesday. They've already contacted several manufacturers, but no one can guarantee the required characteristics. It's the perfect opportunity to get started. A difficult order that our competitors can't handle. Exactly what the new company was supposed to specialize in. Okay, let's meet tomorrow and discuss the details. After talking to Gerald, I sat at my desk for a long time, adjusting my plans. Perhaps I would have to start earlier than expected, but that was even better. Theoretical calculations would turn into practical results faster. On Monday morning, I was at Frank Miller's office at exactly 9 o'clock. Registering the new company took less time than expected. All the documents had been prepared in advance. All that remained was to sign them and pay the government fees. Congratulations, Cyprian, Frank said, handing me the registration certificate. Industrial Coating Solutions is officially in existence. Holding the document in my hands, I felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. Starting a new business at the age of 72 was a gamble, but the alternative seemed even worse. Frank, now we need to apply for licenses to manufacture and sell chemical products. That will take longer, about 2 weeks if all the documents are in order. Can you speed up the process? Yes, if there is an urgent production need, but that will require additional references and justifications. Considering Gerald's call about the order from Premium Construction, there was indeed urgency. I asked Frank to prepare the documents for expedited licensing. After visiting the lawyer, I drove to Thomas Hudson's warehouse. I needed to finalize the purchase of the equipment and arrange for its delivery. Cyprian, everything is ready, Thomas said, pointing to the loaded truck. The equipment is packed. The documents are ready. When should we deliver it? Right now, if possible. We drove to Edward Palmer's workshop. Unloading and installing the equipment took the whole day. Edward helped with the electricity and water connections. Without his support, it would have taken much longer. Cyprian, it's looking good, he said, inspecting the installed mixers. In a week, you'll have a fully operational production facility, if everything goes according to plan. In the evening, I met with Gerald Stevens to discuss the details of the order from Premium Construction. The customer's requirements turned out to be even more complex than I had anticipated. Cyprian, they need paints that are resistant to concentrated ammonia at temperatures up to 80 degrees Celsius, Gerald explained. Plus, they need to be resistant to alkaline solutions and mechanical stress. That's a difficult task. Conventional epoxy compounds won't withstand such conditions. That's why no one can take on this order. And the volume is decent, about 5,000 liters of paint. 5,000 liters at a special price could provide startup capital for business development for several months ahead. What's the deadline? 1 month from the date of signing the contract. 1 month is a tight deadline, but it's quite realistic with the right production organization. Gerald, who makes the decision on the choice of supplier? The chief project engineer, Daniel Wood. I know him. I can arrange a meeting. That would be great. Gerald called Daniel right in front of me and arranged a meeting for the next day. In the evening, I sat at home studying technical literature on special coatings. Over the years, I had accumulated an extensive library of reference books, magazines, and scientific articles. I needed to find the optimal formula for a paint that would meet all of the customer's requirements. The base had to be a modified epoxy resin with the addition of zinc pigments for corrosion protection. But the main problem was ammonia resistance. Conventional hardeners were destroyed by its effects. The solution was found in one of the German scientific articles: the use of a special polyamide hardener in combination with organofluorine additives. This combination ensured chemical resistance while maintaining the mechanical properties of the coating. On Tuesday morning, I met with Daniel Wood at the Premium Construction office. Daniel turned out to be a serious, middle-aged engineer with a practical mind. Mr. Dudley, Gerald said that you can solve our problem with special paints. I have studied your requirements. The task is difficult, but feasible. Do you have experience working with similar coatings? 20 years ago, I developed paints for the petrochemical industry. The operating conditions were similar. Daniel listened carefully to my suggestions for the composition of the coating and asked a few technical questions. That sounds reasonable. Can you provide a sample for testing? Of course. The trial composition will be ready in a week. Okay. What about the price? $120 per liter of finished paint. Daniel didn't seem surprised. The price was high, but it was considered normal for special coatings. What about quality guarantees? Full refund in case of non-compliance with the declared characteristics, plus free technical support for a year. An interesting offer. When can you start work? As soon as we get the sample test results. We agreed that I would provide a sample in a week, and he would conduct the necessary tests in his laboratory. After meeting with Daniel, I went to a supplier of special components. I needed to order a polyamide hardener and organofluorine additives. Without them, it would be impossible to create the right formula. Special Chemicals was located in an industrial area and specialized in rare chemical reagents. Manager Stephen Clark listened to my requirements. Mr. Dudley, we have those components, but they are expensive. The polyamide hardener costs $80 per kilogram. And the organofluorine additives? $200 per kilogram. The high cost of the components explained why other manufacturers did not take on such orders, but with the finished paint costing $120 per liter, the profitability remained acceptable. Stephen, what quantities can you supply? Anything within reason, but the delivery time is 2 weeks. Can't you speed it up? We can for an additional 20% charge. Given the tight project deadlines, the extra charge was justified. I placed an order for the necessary components with expedited delivery. The next few days were spent preparing the production site for launch. Edward helped set up the equipment, connect the ventilation system, and set up a warehouse for raw materials. By the end of the week, everything was ready for the first trial batches. On Friday morning, the components from Stephen Clark arrived. I personally checked the quality of each delivery. The polyamide hardener had the correct consistency and color, and the organofluorine additives met the technical specifications. I did the first trial mix myself, carefully monitoring each stage. Mixing the components required precise adherence to proportions in temperature conditions. The slightest mistake could ruin the entire batch. After 4 hours, the paint was ready. Visually, it looked right. Uniform texture, the right color, no foreign inclusions. But the main test was still ahead, testing for chemical resistance. I applied the paint to several metal samples and placed them in special baths with aggressive solutions. One sample was placed in an ammonia solution, another in an alkaline environment, and the third in acid for comparison. The test results would be visible in 24 hours. On Saturday morning, I returned to the workshop to check the samples. The coating had withstood the effects of ammonia and alkali without any visible changes. No peeling, no color change, no loss of gloss. The control sample in acid also looked good. The formula worked correctly. Now I could prepare a sample for the customer. On Monday, I met with Daniel Wood and gave him the paint samples along with a detailed description of the composition and recommendations for use. Mr. Dudley, when will the test results be ready? In 5 business days, we need to run a full cycle of tests. Okay. If the results are positive, are you ready to sign the contract? Of course. And do your production facilities allow you to fulfill the order on time? Yes, a month will be enough. Daniel nodded and put the samples in special packaging. Then we'll wait for the test results. The next few days were spent waiting. I used this time to set up the production process, order additional raw materials, and prepare documentation. By the time the test results were received, everything had to be ready for immediate launch of serial production. On Thursday morning, Daniel Wood called. Mr. Dudley, I have excellent news. Your paint has passed all the tests. The chemical resistance is excellent, and the mechanical properties are also top-notch. So can we proceed with the contract? Yes, when can you come by? Right now. The contract was signed that same day. 5,000 liters of special paint at a price of $120 per liter. The total cost of the order was $600,000, a substantial amount for a startup company. Mr. Dudley, Daniel said as he signed, if this project is successful, we will have more orders. Premium Construction is planning several similar projects. The prospect of long-term cooperation opened up good opportunities for business development. In the evening, I sat at home with the signed contract in my hands. The first major order has been received and production is ready to start. In a month, Industrial Coating Solutions will deliver the first batch of products. I wonder how things are going with Christopher and Daphne. It had been more than 2 weeks since I left Dudley and Partners. Enough time for the first problems to make themselves felt. But that was no longer my concern. I now had my own company, my own plans, my own challenges. Time will tell which path will prove more successful. Exactly 7 days after that humiliating conversation in the office, I arrived at the Dudley and Partners building. But now I wasn't in my old car, but behind the wheel of a black Rolls-Royce Phantom, which I had rented especially for the occasion. The powerful car stopped smoothly near the main entrance, attracting the attention of everyone nearby. A lot had changed in those 7 days. The information I received from old acquaintances in the industry allowed me to form a complete picture of what was happening at my former company. And that picture was catastrophic. Gerald Stevens said that the quality issues at Dudley and Partners had become critical. The change of suppliers initiated by Christopher and Daphne had turned into a real disaster. 3 major customers had already filed quality complaints, and Harrison Construction was threatening to terminate a long-term contract. But the most interesting information came from Robert Keith, an acquaintance of mine from a neighboring state. It turned out that his company was looking for a reliable supplier of industrial paints. Their previous contractor had gone bankrupt, leaving them without coatings for a major industrial project. Cyprian, if you can arrange for the delivery of quality products, we are ready to sign an exclusive 2-year contract, he told me on the phone 3 days ago. The contract is worth $8 million, more than the annual turnover of Dudley and Partners. And that contract was now in my briefcase, signed and sealed. Getting out of the car, I adjusted my tie and picked up the leather folder with the documents. It contained papers that would radically change the situation in Townsend's paint industry. The secretary at the reception desk recognized me, but she had trouble hiding her surprise at the sight of the luxurious car outside the window. Mr. Dudley, are you here to see someone? Christopher and Daphne. Tell them I have some documents that will interest them. A few minutes later, they both came down to the lobby. Christopher looked exhausted. Apparently, problems with customers were not easy for him. Daphne tried to remain calm, but the tension was evident in her every movement. Father? Christopher looked at me in confusion, then at the Rolls-Royce outside the window. Where did you get that car? I rented it for today. I wanted our meeting to take place in a suitable setting. What meeting? Daphne asked coldly. You don't work here anymore. That's exactly why I came. I have some news I wanted to share. We went into the very office where I had been publicly humiliated and fired a week ago. Now I was sitting here as a guest, holding documents that could bury their business. Christopher, Daphne, I began calmly, remember what you told me last week? That I'm useless? That I'm hindering the company's development? Christopher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Father, we were stressed out because of problems with the order. No excuses. You said exactly what you thought. And now I want to show you something interesting. I opened the folder and took out the first document. The day before yesterday, I signed an exclusive contract to supply industrial paints with the Industrial Development Group Corporation from a neighboring state. I put a copy of the contract on the table. Daphne grabbed the document and began to read. With each line, her face grew paler. $8 million for 2 years, I continued. Specialized coatings for industrial facilities. What you called an unpromising direction? That's impossible, Christopher blurted out. You don't have the production capacity. I have connections and a reputation, and production can be organized quickly when you know what to do. Daphne silently studied the figures in the contract. $8 million over 2 years is more than the entire turnover of Dudley and Partners. But that's not all, I continued, taking out the next document. Yesterday, Harrison Construction officially terminated its contract with your company. They were not satisfied with the quality of the latest deliveries. Christopher and Daphne exchanged glances. Apparently, they already knew about this, but were hoping to resolve the issue somehow. And guess who James Harrison is considering as a new supplier? I placed another document on the table, a preliminary agreement of intent with Harrison Construction. Me, I said simply, the man you called useless a week ago. Daphne grabbed the edge of the table. Cyprian, this is unfair competition. You used our company's work. What work, Daphne? The reputation you destroyed yourself? The clients you lost because you chased after cheap prices? Christopher was silent, realizing the gravity of the situation. Losing 2 major clients meant the collapse of the company. Father, he finally said, maybe we can come to an agreement. You come back, we restore our relationships with our clients. Come back, I sneered, after you yelled at me to get out? After you called me a burden? We were wrong, Daphne admitted. Our emotions got the better of us. Maybe, but it's too late. I got up from the table and gathered my documents. I have my own plans now. And you got what you wanted, complete freedom. Enjoy it. Heading for the door, I turned around. By the way, there's more news that will interest you. Christopher and Daphne froze in anticipation. In a month, I'm starting my own business. And do you know what I've decided to call it? Dudley Industrial Coatings. It's a beautiful name, isn't it? It preserves the family tradition. You can't, Daphne exclaimed. That's our trademark. Your trademark is Dudley and Partners, and Dudley Industrial Coatings is a completely different name. The lawyers have checked. There are no violations. Christopher paled, realizing the consequences. 2 companies with similar names in the same city. Customers will be confused, and most will likely choose the company with a proven leader. But that's not the most interesting part, I continued. The most interesting part is that I've decided to hire all of your best specialists. Thomas Crane has already agreed to become our chief technologist. Nancy Drew will be our lead lab technician. That's impossible. Daphne was close to panic. It's more than possible. People want to work with professionals, not with those who chase cheapness at the expense of quality. I reached the door and turned around one last time. And you know what's funny about this story? I said, looking at their shocked faces. 7 days ago, you had a thriving company with an experienced manager and established connections. You threw it all away by calling me useless. And today, I am your main competitor with the best employees, the biggest clients, and an $8 million contract. How do you like the results of your modern management? Leaving the office, I got into my Rolls-Royce and slowly drove away from the Dudley and Partners building. In the rearview mirror, I saw Christopher and Daphne standing at the window, watching the car drive away. In a month, Dudley Industrial Coatings will begin operations. And what happens to Dudley and Partners is no longer my concern. They wanted freedom from my influence. Now they have all the freedom in the world and all the responsibility for the consequences of their decisions.